Some secrets are meant to protect us, others are meant to destroy us. And sometimes the line between the two is so thin that even those who keep them cannot tell the difference anymore. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten time. Cardboard boxes stacked against wooden beams, old furniture draped in sheets like ghosts waiting to be remembered. It had been 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks since the woman who raised you alone was lowered into the ground beside an empty grave marked with your father's name. A grave for a man whose body never came home from Vietnam. You weren't looking for anything in particular that afternoon, just clearing out a lifetime of accumulated memories, preparing the house for sale. But then your hand brushed against something wedged between 2 boxes in the far corner, a bundle wrapped in faded blue fabric, tied with string that crumbled at your touch. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to you, all in your father's handwriting, all unopened by your childhood hands, though the envelopes had clearly been opened before, read by someone else, then carefully sealed again. Your mother had hidden them. For 40 years, she had hidden them. The postmarks ranged from 1972 to 1975. Your father was declared missing in action in 1973. These letters existed in a timeline that shouldn't have been possible. Dead men don't write letters for 2 years after they die. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was what you would discover in the oldest letter, written just days before he vanished from official records forever. A truth so dangerous that it required a man to erase himself from existence. A secret that explained why your mother looked over her shoulder for the rest of her life. Why she never spoke his name without a shadow crossing her face. Why she moved you across the country when you were 5 years old and changed your last name without explanation. The answers were in these letters. But some answers come with a price. Some truths once known cannot be unknown, and some secrets have teeth that can still bite even decades after they were buried. This is the story of what those letters revealed, and why, perhaps, they should have stayed hidden forever. You didn't read them in order at first. You couldn't. Your hands shook as you tore through the envelopes, desperate for any words from the father you barely remembered, the father whose face you knew only from 3 photographs your mother kept in a drawer, the father who became a ghost story you told yourself at night. Did he really exist? Did he really hold you? Did he really love you? Or was that just something mothers say to sons about fathers who never come home? The first letter you opened was dated April 1974. Your hand froze as you read the opening lines. My son, you're 5 years old now. I missed your birthday again. I wonder if your mother told you about me, or if I'm already fading from your memory like morning fog. I wonder if you ask about me anymore, or if you've accepted my absence as just another fact of your small world. I hope you don't remember me. It would be easier that way. Easier for you to grow up thinking I was just another casualty of a war that took so many fathers. Easier than knowing the truth. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The ink had faded to a rust-brown color, like dried blood. I saw you last month. Did you know that? I was outside your school in Sacramento. I watched you play at recess. You were wearing a red jacket, and you were laughing. I hadn't heard you laugh since you were 2 years old. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, and the most painful. Because I was 50 feet away, and I couldn't call out to you. I couldn't run to you. I couldn't pick you up and tell you that your father isn't dead, that he thinks about you every single day, that he would give anything to be the man who tucks you in at night, instead of the ghost who watches from across the street. Your throat tightened. The letter continued for 3 more pages, describing moments he'd witnessed from a distance. Your first day of kindergarten, a scraped knee in the park, a birthday party where you wore a paper crown and blew out 6 candles while he watched through a neighbor's fence. He was alive. He was watching, and he never reached out. The rage came first, hot and sudden. What kind of father does this? What kind of man abandons his family and then tortures himself by watching from the shadows? What possible justification could exist? But you needed to know, so you forced yourself to read chronologically, starting with the most recent letters and working backward. Each one was a window into a man slowly losing his mind. The letters from 75 were barely coherent. Desperate rambling about staying away, keeping you safe, sacrificing everything. References to what happened in Quan Tri and what they did and the ones who know. Then the letters from 74 became clearer, more controlled. He described his new life under a different name, working construction jobs in Nevada, sleeping in cheap motels, cutting his hair short and growing a beard to change his appearance. He wrote about seeing your mother at a grocery store once, how she looked tired and sad, how he wanted to walk up to her and take away all her pain, but knew that his presence would only bring more pain. "They're still looking," he wrote in November 74. "I'm certain it was him. Same eyes, same walk. He was at a diner in Reno, and when he looked at me, I saw recognition start to form. I left immediately, drove for 6 hours straight. I can't let them find me, because if they find me, they'll ask questions, and if I don't answer, they'll know why. And if they know why, they'll know that your mother might know, and then they'll come for her, and for you." Who were they? What happened in Quan Tri? What did he witness that was worth destroying his entire life? The answer was in the oldest letter, the one dated June 8, 1973. 3 days before he was declared missing in action, 3 days before he ceased to exist in any official capacity. Your hands trembled as you opened it. The envelope was thicker than the others. Inside were 4 handwritten pages in something else, something that crinkled. Photographs. You set the photos aside and began to read. "My dearest son, if you're reading this, then I am either dead or I've managed to stay hidden long enough that your mother felt it was safe to let you know the truth. I pray it's the latter. I pray that by the time you read these words, enough time has passed that the men who would kill to keep their secrets are dead themselves or too old to care anymore. But I can't be certain of that, so I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. Whatever you do with this information, whatever you choose to believe or not believe, you must protect your mother. She is innocent in all of this. She knew nothing until I told her, and what I told her could get her killed if the wrong people find out." The letter went on to describe a night patrol in Quan Tri province in May of 1973. Your father's platoon had been tracking suspected enemy movement through a village. They found nothing. No weapons, no soldiers, just farmers and families. "We should have left. We should have reported no contact and moved on. But Lieutenant Morrison said he had intel that weapons were hidden in one of the houses. He ordered us to search. When the village elder protested, Morrison shot him, just like that. No warning, no hesitation. The old man fell in front of his granddaughter. She was maybe 7 years old. She started screaming. Your father's handwriting became more erratic here. The letters pressed hard into the paper. What happened next, I can barely write. Morrison ordered us to search every house. When people resisted, he gave the order to fire. I refused. So did Jackson and Tomas, but 8 others followed orders. 15 minutes later, 23 civilians were dead. Men, women, children. Morrison called it a firefight, said they were armed insurgents. He ordered us to plant weapons we'd confiscated from a previous patrol, create a scene that would justify what happened. The paper was stained here, whether from water or tears I couldn't tell. I took photographs. I had a small camera I'd been using to document my tour. I took photos of the bodies before the weapons were planted. I took photos of Morrison giving orders. I took photos of the planted evidence, and then I hid the film in my boot and said nothing. Because I was a coward. Because I was 24 years old and terrified and surrounded by men who had just committed murder, men who would kill again to protect themselves. The letter explained what happened next. Your father tried to report it through proper channels. He went to his commanding officer, Captain Wendell, but Wendell was already aware. He'd been the one to authorize the operation. He told your father that if he pursued this, he would be court-martialed for disobeying orders and creating false evidence, that his testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized soldier, that the photographs would disappear. He told me that accidents happen in war, your father wrote, that sometimes we have to make hard choices, that the story would be that we engaged enemy combatants and prevailed, that I should be proud. Proud. Your father kept copies of the photographs. He sent one set to your mother with instructions to hide them. He kept another set with him. He planned to wait until he returned stateside and then take the evidence to military investigators or journalists or anyone who would listen. But 3 days before his scheduled departure from Vietnam, he overheard a conversation. Morrison and Wendell talking in low voices behind the supply tent. They knew he had evidence. Someone had informed them. They were planning to stage his death, make it look like enemy action. A body would be found, identified, sent home for burial. Except it wouldn't be his body. I had hours to decide, he wrote. I could try to survive long enough to get stateside, knowing they would kill me before I ever boarded that plane. I could go to military police, but I had no way of knowing who was compromised. Morrison had connections. Wendell had influence. For all I knew, the entire chain of command was protecting them. Or I could disappear, fake my own death before they could kill me for real, take on a new identity, live in hiding, never see you or your mother again. The choice he made was evident. He disappeared into the chaos of war. Deserted, technically, though desertion implies cowardice. What he did required a different kind of courage, the courage to erase yourself, to become a ghost, to watch your son grow up from a distance and never reach out, because reaching out meant putting that son in danger. I am a dead man walking, the letter concluded. But as long as I stay dead, you and your mother can live. That's all that matters now. That's all that will ever matter. I love you, son. I'm sorry I won't be there to teach you how to throw a baseball, or help you with your homework, or walk you down the aisle someday. I'm sorry you'll grow up thinking your father was just another casualty, but I need you to know that every day I stay away, every day I remain dead to the world, I do it because I love you more than my own life, more than my own identity, more than my own name. You are my son, and a father protects his son, even if that protection means the son will never know it. The letter was signed David Chin, your father's name, the name you barely knew because your mother changed it when you were 5, giving you her maiden name instead. You sat in the dusty attic as the afternoon light faded, holding a letter written by a dead man who wasn't actually dead, a man who witnessed an atrocity and paid for his conscience with his entire existence, a man who loved you enough to become nothing. And then you remembered the photographs. You pulled them from the envelope with shaking hands. They were small, faded. The colors shifted to an otherworldly palette of greens and oranges and browns, but the images were clear enough. Bodies in a village clearing, small bodies, old bodies, a woman clutching a child, an elderly man face down in the dirt. And in one photo, clear as day, Lieutenant Morrison standing with his rifle, pointing at soldiers as they arranged weapons next to the corpses. Evidence, undeniable evidence of a war crime committed 50 years ago. And then you saw the last photograph in the stack. It wasn't from Vietnam. It was recent, in color, high quality. It was a photograph of you at your college graduation 8 years ago. You were standing with your mother, both of you smiling for whoever was taking the picture, but in the background, slightly out of focus, was a man with gray hair and a beard. He was watching you. His face was older, weathered by decades of hiding, but his eyes were unmistakable. Your father's eyes. He had been there, watching, even after all those years, even after all those letters, even after becoming a ghost. He was still protecting you from a distance. And in that moment, Sitting in the attic with 40 years of hidden letters scattered around you, you realize that your mother had known all along. She'd known he was alive. She'd known he was watching. She'd known where every letter came from and made the impossible choice to hide them because revealing him meant revealing her, and revealing her meant putting everyone in danger. She'd carried that secret for 40 decades, right up until her death. She never told you, never gave you the choice. She'd protected you the same way your father had, by letting you believe a lie. The question now was simple and impossibly complex. What do you do with this information? Do you go to authorities with 50-year-old evidence of a war crime? Do you try to find your father, who might still be alive, who might still be hiding? Do you risk exposing him after he sacrificed everything to stay hidden? Or do you do what your parents did? Do you protect the secret? Burn the letters, destroy the photographs, let the dead stay dead, and the ghosts remain ghosts. The sun was setting outside the attic window. You gathered the letters carefully, placed them back in the faded blue fabric, but you couldn't let it end there. You needed to know more about Morrison, about Wendell, about what happened to the men who committed murder and whether they'd ever face justice, or if they'd lived comfortable lives while your father rotted in exile. You needed answers, even if those answers meant consequences, even if those answers meant waking ghosts that should stay buried. The research consumed you. For weeks you barely slept. Every spare moment was spent in front of a computer screen, diving into military records, obituaries, newspaper archives, anything that might tell you what happened to the men your father accused. Lieutenant Edward Morrison, discharged honorably in 1976, returned to his hometown in Georgia. The trail went cold after that. No criminal record, no scandals, nothing that suggested he'd ever faced consequences for what happened in Quang Tri. You found a single photograph from a local newspaper in 1983, Morrison at a veterans event, shaking hands with a congressman. He was smiling, proud. Captain James Wendell continued his military career, rose to the rank of colonel, retired in 1994 with full honors. There was even a commendation ceremony. The newspaper article praised his distinguished service and his leadership during the difficult years of the Vietnam War. He died in 2006, heart attack. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The men who pulled triggers that night? You found 3 of them, all living quiet lives. One was a mechanic in Ohio. Another worked at a post office in Texas. The third had died in a car accident in the 90s. None of them had ever been questioned. None of them had ever been held accountable. Your father had given up everything, and the men he'd tried to expose had lived normal lives, comfortable lives. They'd gotten away with it. But then you found something else, something that changed everything. A blog post from 2018, written by a woman named Sarah Morrison, Edward Morrison's daughter. She was in her 40s, a social worker living in Oregon. The post was titled, "Sins of the Father." In it, she described her childhood growing up with a father who drank too much, who had nightmares, who would sometimes wake up screaming about villages and children and blood. She described how he became abusive when she was a teenager, how he would rant about betrayal and cowardice and the ones who didn't understand that war requires hard choices, and how he died in 2015 from liver failure, alone and bitter, having driven away everyone who tried to love him. In the comments section of that blog post, someone had responded, a username, Quang Tri Truth. The comment was short. "Your father committed war crimes. He murdered civilians. I have proof. I've been too afraid to come forward because of what it might cost, but you deserve to know the truth about what he did." The comment was dated 3 months ago. You clicked on the username, hoping for more information. The profile was bare. No other posts, no other comments, but there was a contact option. You sent a message. You didn't expect a response, but the next morning, there was one. Who are you? Your fingers hovered over the keyboard. How do you answer that question? How do you say,
I'm the son of a man who witnessed what your father did and paid for it with his entire life. In the end, you told the truth, all of it, about the letters, about the photographs, about your father's disappearance and his decades in hiding. You attached scanned copies of the photographs, the evidence he'd kept hidden for 50 years. The response came 6 hours later. I've been looking for this evidence for 7 years, since my father died, and I found a journal he kept. He wrote about Quang Tri, about what they did, about a soldier who tried to report it and who disappeared before he could testify. He wrote that he lived with the guilt every day, that it destroyed him, that he deserved to be destroyed. I tried to find records of the incident, military archives, congressional investigations, anything, but there was nothing. No official acknowledgement that it ever happened. I started to think maybe my father's guilt was a delusion, a trauma-induced false memory. But these photographs, these prove it was real. You corresponded for days. Sarah Morrison told you everything she knew. Her father's journal entries were fragmentary, written in the last years of his life when dementia was already taking hold. But the themes were consistent. The village, the massacre, the cover-up, the soldier who had a camera, the orders to eliminate him before he could talk. He wrote that they failed to kill him, Sarah wrote, that he disappeared before they could stage the accident, that Wendell was furious, that they spent years looking for him, but eventually assumed he'd actually deserted and died somewhere in the jungle. My father wrote that he hoped that was true, that death would have been kinder than living with what they'd done. You told her about your father's letters, about his life in hiding, about watching you from a distance for decades. He's still alive, you typed, and even as you wrote it, you weren't sure if it was true. The most recent letter was from 1975, nearly 50 years ago. He would be in his 70s now. The photograph from your graduation was 8 years old. Anything could have happened since then. But Sarah's next message made your blood run cold. If he's still alive, he's still in danger. My father died in 2015. Wendell died in 2006, but there were others involved. I found names in the journal. A Sergeant Hodges, a Corporal Martinez, a private named Clemens. I looked them up. Hodges is dead, died in 2002, but Martinez is alive, living in Arizona, and Clemens is alive, living in Maryland, working as a private security consultant. I tried to contact them 2 years ago, asking about Quang Tri. Both of them threatened legal action if I continued harassing them. Martinez's lawyer sent a letter saying any accusations of war crimes were slanderous and would be prosecuted. Clemens had someone show up at my house, a man in a suit, who told me that digging up old war stories was dangerous for everyone involved. He said my father had made peace with what happened, and I should respect that. But the way he said it, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. You read the message 3 times. Your father had been right. The danger was real. 50 years later, the men who had committed murder in a Vietnamese village were still willing to threaten anyone who might expose them. Which meant your father had been right to stay hidden, right to remain dead, right to sacrifice his entire life. But it also meant that if you did nothing, if you let this stay buried, then your father's sacrifice meant nothing. The men who murdered civilians would die peacefully, the victims would remain forgotten, the truth would disappear with the last person who remembered it. You spent a week paralyzed by the decision. Do you pursue justice for something that happened 5 decades ago? Do you risk your safety and Sarah's safety to hold accountable men who are themselves elderly now? Is there even a legal mechanism to prosecute war crimes from Vietnam? And most importantly, do you have the right to make that choice when it was your father who paid the price and who specifically chose to stay hidden to protect you? The answer came from an unexpected source. You received a letter, an actual physical letter delivered by mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the same careful script you recognized from the attic letters. My son, I know you found the letters. I know you're trying to decide what to do. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I've watched you grow into a good man, a better man than I ever was. You have a choice now that I never gave myself. You can choose to speak the truth even if it costs you, or you can choose to stay silent even if it haunts you. Either choice is valid. Either choice comes with a price, but whatever you choose, know that my life was not wasted. Every day I stayed hidden was a day you got to live freely. That was enough for me. That will always be enough. If you choose to speak, I will support you. If you choose to stay silent, I will support you. I am an old man now. I have lived far longer than I ever expected to. The men who wanted me dead are mostly gone. The few who remain are too old and too tired to do much damage anymore. So, if you want to find me, if you want to finally meet the father who has only ever been a ghost to you, I will be waiting. There is a diner in Flagstaff, Arizona, called Rosa's. I am there every Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. I sit in the last booth by the window, I drink black coffee, and I read the newspaper, and I wait. I have been waiting for 8 years, ever since your graduation, hoping that maybe someday you would find the letters and understand why I had to leave. Come or don't come, speak or stay silent, whatever you choose, you are my son, and I love you. The letter was signed and dated. Last week. He was alive. He was in Flagstaff. He was waiting. You sat with that knowledge for 3 days, barely eating, barely sleeping. The decision felt too big, too permanent. If you went to find him, you couldn't unknow what you'd learned. If you went public with the evidence, you couldn't take it back. The consequences would ripple outward, affecting not just you but your father, Sarah Morrison, potentially dozens of others. But in the end, the choice wasn't about consequences. It was about truth, and it was about a father who had paid for his conscience with his entire life. You called Sarah Morrison. You told her about the letter. You made a plan. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, you walked into Rosa's Diner in Flagstaff, Arizona. The place was nearly empty, just a waitress refilling coffee and an old man in the last booth by the window. He looked up when you entered. His hair was white now. His face was weathered and lined with deep grooves, but his eyes were the same eyes you remembered from the 3 photographs, the same eyes from the graduation photo, the same eyes that had been watching you from a distance for 50 years. You walked to the booth. He stood up slowly, uncertain. You were face to face with the ghost who had haunted your entire life. "Hello, son," he said. His voice cracked. "I wasn't sure you'd come." You didn't know what to say. There were too many words, too many years, too many questions. So you said the only thing that felt true. "I found your letters." He nodded slowly. "I hoped you would. Your mother, she promised me she'd keep them safe, that when the time was right, when it was safe, she'd let you find them. I guess she kept that promise." You slid into the booth across from him. Up close you could see the toll the years had taken, the weight of living as someone else, the burden of watching your family from afar. "Why did you never come home?" you asked, even though you knew the answer. You needed him to say it. "Because coming home would have put you in danger," he said simply, "and I'd rather live 1,000 lifetimes alone than risk 1 day of harm coming to you."
You pulled out your phone, showed him the messages from Sarah Morrison, told him about the men who were still alive, about the threats, about the choice you were facing. He listened quietly, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When you finished, he was silent for a long moment. "I made my choice 50 years ago," he finally said. "I chose to preserve the evidence, to stay hidden, to hope that someday, when enough time had passed, the truth could come out safely. I think that time is now. These men are old. They have no power anymore. They can't disappear people like they could back then. And the world is different now. People care about war crimes, about justice, about accountability. If you want to bring this forward, I'll stand beside you. I'll testify. I'll give my name back and face whatever consequences come. Because you're right. If we stay silent, then all of this was for nothing. The people who died in that village deserve to be remembered. The truth deserves to see daylight." 3 months later, you and Sarah Morrison held a press conference. You presented the photographs, your father's testimony, Sarah's father's journal. The evidence was undeniable. The story made national news. Military investigators reopened inquiries into the Quang Tree incident. 2 of the surviving soldiers initially denied everything, then, faced with photographic evidence, admitted their involvement. They pointed fingers at dead commanding officers. They claimed they were following orders. Carlos Martinez died of a heart attack 2 weeks after the story broke. His family claimed the stress killed him. Maybe it did. Maybe guilt killed him. Maybe he'd been dying slowly for 50 years and just finally ran out of time. James Clemens was investigated but never charged. Statute of limitations, lack of jurisdiction, the legal complications of prosecuting 50-year-old war crimes committed in a foreign country by soldiers following orders from dead superiors. He gave one interview where he said, "We were at war. We did what we thought was necessary. I'm sorry civilians died, but that's what war is." He never said he was innocent, just that he was sorry. The village in Quang Tri was located. Survivors were found. Old men and women now, who remembered the night Americans came and their families died. They identified the location from the photographs. They confirmed the details. They thanked you for finally acknowledging what happened. One woman who had been a child that night, who had hidden while her parents were killed, said something that you think about often. "For 50 years, I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I remembered. Maybe my child's mind made it worse than it was. But no, it happened. It was real. And now the world knows. That's all I ever wanted, just for the world to know." Your father lived for 2 more years after coming out of hiding. He gave testimony at military hearings. He spoke at veterans groups about the importance of conscience even in wartime. He met you for coffee every week. You learned who he was, not the ghost, not the idea, the actual man, flawed and haunted and still carrying guilt for not stopping the massacre, even though trying to stop it had cost him everything. He died peacefully in a hospital bed, with you holding his hand. His last words were, "I got to know my son. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." Sarah Morrison became an advocate for recognizing forgotten war crimes. She started a foundation in her father's name, dedicated to investigating and acknowledging civilian casualties from American military actions. She says her father would have hated the irony, a foundation bearing his name dedicated to exposing crimes like the ones he participated in. But she thinks maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the only kind of redemption possible for sins that can never be forgiven. As for you, you kept the letters, all of them. You had them archived and donated to a museum dedicated to the Vietnam War. They sit in a climate-controlled room now, preserved for future generations. Evidence of what one man sacrificed for his conscience. Evidence of the cost of speaking truth in a time of lies. Sometimes you wonder what would have happened if your mother had given you those letters when you were younger, if you'd known your father was alive, if you'd gone looking for him decades earlier. Would it have made a difference? Would it have put everyone in more danger? Would your father have had more years with his family, or would he have been killed before you ever got the chance to know him? There's no way to know. The past is fixed. The choices were made. Your parents did what they thought was right. They protected you the only way they knew how, by keeping secrets, by bearing burdens alone, by sacrificing their own happiness for your safety. And now you carry your own burden, the knowledge of what humans are capable of, what systems will do to protect themselves, how truth can be buried for decades and still claw its way back to the surface, how fathers love their children, even from a distance, even in silence, even when that silence costs them everything. The letters sit in their archive. The photographs are part of the historical record now. The village in Quang Tri has a memorial. The survivors have their acknowledgement. The truth, as messy and incomplete and complicated as it is finally in the light. It's not justice, not really. Most of the guilty are dead. The only ones who are alive will never face real consequences. But it's something. It's a record. It's a refusal to forget. And sometimes that's all we can ask for, that someone remembers, that someone says, this happened, these people died, and it mattered. Your father's name is on the memorial in Quang Tri, not as a perpetrator, but as the man who tried to speak truth, who sacrificed his life to preserve evidence, who loved his family enough to become a ghost. David Chen, father, soldier, witness. ghost, finally at peace. The letters we carry are heavier than we know. The secrets we keep to protect the ones we love can become prisons that last generations. Your father made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. He chose truth over safety. He chose conscience over comfort, and he paid for that choice with 50 years of exile. Was it worth it? That's not for me to answer. Maybe it's not for anyone to answer except the people who died in that village, the ones whose names we'll never know. The ones who became casualties not just of war, but of the cover-up that followed. The ones who were forgotten until an old man's photographs proved they existed. This story asks us to confront uncomfortable questions. What do we owe to the truce? What do we owe to the dead? What do we owe to our families when those obligations conflict? When does loyalty become complicity? When does silence become betrayal? The men who committed the massacre in Quang Tri believed they were following orders. They believed they were doing their duty. They believed that war requires hard choices and that some sacrifices are necessary. They lived entire lives believing that, or at least telling themselves they believed it. Whether they actually found peace with those beliefs, we'll never know, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Morrison drank himself to death. Wendell received honors, but left behind a journal that suggested he knew exactly what he'd done. Martinez died when the truth came out. Clemens will take his version of the story to the grave. And David Chen, who refused to stay silent, who refused to let the truth die, paid a price that seems impossibly high until you understand what fathers will do for their children. He gave up his name, his identity, his family, his entire life, not for glory, not for recognition, but so his son could grow up safe. That's the kind of sacrifice we can barely comprehend. That's the kind of love that echoes across decades. That's the kind of choice that defines what it means to be human in the face of inhumanity. If this story was impactful, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in David Chen's position? What would you have done if you found those letters? Do we have a responsibility to speak truth, even when it costs us everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this matter to you, if you believe these voices need to be heard, subscribe to this channel. There are more letters out there, more stories of sacrifice and silence and truth that refuses to be buried, more histories that need to be told before the last witnesses are gone. The next video is waiting for you. Another letter, another truth, another life changed by words on a page. Watch it now, because some stories can't wait, some truths are too important to ignore, and some fathers never stop loving their sons, even when they can only do it from the shadows. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that the truth matters, even when it costs 50 years too late. Remember them. Remember all of them. The victims, the witnesses, the ones who paid the price for conscience, the ones who loved enough to disappear. Remember.